The forest was quiet, too quiet for comfort. Tall, alien trees stood like frozen giants, their black bark shining under the pale light of two moons. Strange insects hummed in the distance, and the air carried the smell of wet moss and sharp metal, as if the land itself was alive. He moved carefully, his boots sinking into the damp soil. The human had learned long ago that this place was not safe. Every step could bring danger, and every shadow could hide teeth. Yet he had to survive, and survival meant hunting. His traps were simple but deadly, ropes tied with sharpened sticks covered with leaves hidden in silence. He set them at night, checking them every morning with hope that something edible had been caught. This night felt different, though. The forest seemed to breathe around him, every branch creaking, every leaf whispering. He tightened the strap of his knife and scanned the shadows. Then he heard it, the snap of a rope. His trap had been triggered, his heart jumped. Carefully, he followed the sound. His boots made no noise as he moved between the trees. The snap was followed by a muffled cry, soft but filled with panic. He froze. That was no animal. He pushed past a thick wall of branches and stopped cold. Hanging in the middle of his trap was not the creature he had expected. It was a woman. No, not human, not from Earth. Her skin shimmered faintly blue under the moonlight, her hair long and tangled with leaves, her eyes glowing like fireflies in the dark. The rope cut into her wrists as she twisted and fought, her breathing fast, her voice sharp with fear. She saw him. The moment her eyes met his, she flinched as if struck. She pulled harder against the rope, whispering something in a language he did not understand, her voice breaking with terror. He stood still, shock holding him in place. He had heard rumors, stories told by travelers of alien tribes hidden in the deeper woods. Some said they were savage. Some said they hunted humans. Others said they were victims, always running from stronger masters. He had never believed. Not until now. Her voice grew louder, begging him, pleading in broken words. Only a few made sense, but the meaning was clear. She thought he was going to hurt her. Slowly, he raised his hands, showing they were empty. "I won't harm you," he said, though he doubted she could understand. His voice was low, careful, meant to calm. She shook her head, eyes wide, lips trembling. She pressed her knees to her chest as much as the ropes allowed, shrinking away from him. Fear poured off her like a cold wind. He stepped closer and the rope groaned. She gasped, flinching so violently he thought she might break her arm. He stopped immediately, lifting his hands higher. She whispered again, this time softer, like a prayer. For a long moment, they stared at each other, two strangers trapped by fate. He saw the dirt on her skin, the bruises across her arms, the way her ribs showed beneath her torn clothes. She was starving, exhausted, fragile. He felt something shift inside him, something heavy, a weight he had not known he carried. The hunter became protector in that moment. He pulled his knife from its sheath. Her eyes widened with terror and she thrashed against the rope, a broken cry escaping her lips. He shook his head, trying to calm her. Then, with one quick motion, he cut the rope. She fell to the ground with a soft thud, rolling onto her side. She crawled backward immediately, dragging herself across the dirt, eyes locked on the knife in his hand. He dropped it in front of him, letting it fall into the moss. Then he crouched low, not moving closer, just waiting. She stopped crawling, chest rising and falling fast. Confusion touched her face now. She looked at the knife on the ground, then back at him. "I will not hurt you," he repeated slowly, each word clear. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, her eyes glistened, shining with something beyond fear. She stayed where she was, too weak to run, too afraid to trust. He sighed quietly. He had thought tonight would bring him food. But instead, fate had brought him something else, someone else. He did not know who she was or why she was in the forest, or why she looked at him like he was both her savior and her executioner. But one thing was clear. His trap had caught more than prey. It had caught a secret, one that would change everything. And, as the cold night deepened, he realized the forest was no longer silent. Somewhere far away, voices echoed through the trees, searching, hunting. They were not alone. The woman sat on the damp ground, her arms shaking as if the cold had entered. Her bones, her glowing eyes stayed fixed on him, never blinking, never relaxing. She looked like a trapped bird, free from the rope but still caught in a cage of fear. Every small movement he made her flinch, as though she expected pain at any moment. He did not approach her again. Instead, he stayed crouched by the fallen rope, keeping his distance. The knife lay in the moss between them, a silent reminder of what she thought he might do. He slowly pushed it away from himself, sliding it back toward the shadows so she could see he would not use it against her. Her chest heaved. She pressed her hands against her knees, pulling herself tighter into a ball. Her hair fell forward, wild and tangled, hiding half of her face. But her eyes shone through the strands, glowing softly in the dim light, filled with a terror that cut deeper than any blade. He remembered that fear. He had seen it before. Not in her, but in wounded. Animals caught in traps, their breathing fast, their bodies ready to break themselves just to escape. But she was not an animal. She was someone thinking, someone who understood what might happen next, someone who had already seen too much cruelty. He took a deep breath. "You are safe," he said again, his voice calm and steady. She tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowing as if she tried to understand the tone even if not the words. For a moment, silence hung heavy between them. Then the forest itself broke it. A cry echoed in the distance, harsh and strange, like metal grinding on stone. She gasped, covering her mouth with her hand, trembling so violently that her shoulders shook. She turned toward the sound, then back, to him, her lips moving quickly. He could not understand her words, but her message was clear. Someone was coming, and she feared them more than him. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out. She fell to her knees, her hands clawing at the dirt, as she struggled to rise again. He stepped forward, instinct pushing him to help. She shrieked and fell back, throwing her arm up to shield herself. The sound cut through him like a blade. He stopped instantly, raising both hands to show he meant no harm. She shook her head, whispering through cracked lips. The words came broken, but one word repeated again and again. He listened carefully, his mind piecing it together. Finally, he caught it. Hunter. She was not afraid of him alone. She was afraid of others, people who hunted her. And now, the sound in the distance made it clear they were close. He looked at her, fragile, broken, afraid. And then at the shadows where the strange cry had echoed. If those hunters were after her, then his choices were simple. Leave her and stay safe, or risk his own life to protect her. The decision came faster than he expected. He took a step back, then turned his body slightly so he did not face her directly. He lowered his shoulders, making himself look less threatening. Then he pointed to the thicker trees, the darker path deeper into the forest. "We need to move," he said softly. He doubted she understood the words, but he hoped she felt the urgency in his voice. She hesitated. Her eyes darted from him to the shadows, then back. Finally, she tried to stand again. Her legs shook, but she managed to rise halfway. He stepped closer, slower this time. And when she nearly fell, he reached out but stopped just short of touching her. She looked at his hand, her lips parting as if deciding whether to scream or accept. After a long moment, she placed her trembling fingers against his palm. It was not trust, not yet, but desperation. He helped her to her feet. Her body was light, almost too light. As though weeks of running and hiding had drained her strength, she leaned against him for balance, her breath uneven and shallow. The sound came again from the distance, louder now. She pressed closer against him, whispering something sharp and broken, her voice quivering. Her fear was not just in her eyes anymore. It was in her whole body. She shook as if every step closer to safety was also a step closer to death. He tightened his grip on her arm, steady but gentle. "I won't let them hurt you," he whispered. He knew she might not understand, but sometimes words were not just words. Sometimes the way they were spoken carried the truth. Her eyes lifted to his, wide and searching. For a brief moment the terror softened. Confusion remained, but inside it flickered something else. A tiny spark, fragile but alive. A question unspoken. Why would he protect her when others wanted her dead? They moved slowly into the trees, deeper into the shadows where the forest grew thicker. Each step was a battle for her, each sound from the distance a reminder that the hunters were closing in. Yet for the first time, she was not running alone. And though fear still filled her eyes, something new had begun to grow behind it, a thin, uncertain thread of hope. The forest grew darker as the twin moons sank behind the clouds. Every tree stretched like a shadowy figure, every root twisted like a hidden snake. The human led the way, steady but cautious, his eyes scanning every sound, every flicker in the distance. The woman walked beside him, leaning on him when her strength failed, her glowing eyes wide with fear. The deeper they went, the louder the forest became. Crickets sang, branches cracked under unseen steps, and the wind whispered like voices that refused to stay quiet. The human knew this land had never been safe, yet tonight felt worse. The hunters were moving somewhere close, their cries echoing now and then, strange and metallic. Each call sounded like a warning, a reminder that they were being hunted. He guided her to a fallen tree, hollow inside, where they could crouch and rest for a moment. She collapsed against the trunk, breathing hard, her body trembling from exhaustion. He looked at her face. Dirt streaked her cheeks, bruises marked her arms, but it was the fear in her eyes that struck him most. Her eyes never left the forest. She listened, alert, ready to run even if she had no strength. She had lived in fear long before this night. He wondered how long she had been running and from what cruelty she had escaped. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small canteen. She flinched as he offered it, her hand hesitating before finally taking it. She sipped the water, her lips dry and cracked. When she handed it back, her eyes met his for a second. There was still fear, but also confusion. Why was he helping her when he could have left her? Before he could say anything, the night answered. A growl rolled through the trees, low and deep, shaking the ground beneath them. The woman gasped, her glowing eyes darting to the shadows. The human stiffened, his hand going to the knife at his belt. The growl came again, closer now. A beast moved in the dark. Not a hunter, something worse. The branches snapped as a massive shape pushed forward. The air carried the heavy smell of blood and wet fur. He motioned for her to stay low. She pressed herself against the hollow log, trembling so hard he feared she might give them away. He stepped forward, knife in hand, every muscle tight. From the shadows came a creature the size of a horse, its body covered in thick spines that glowed faintly under the moonlight. Its mouth stretched wide, filled with rows of jagged teeth dripping with saliva. Its eyes glowed red, locking onto them. Instantly, the woman let out a small cry, covering her mouth quickly, but it was too late. The beast lunged. The human leaped sideways, barely avoiding the crushing jaws. He rolled across the dirt, coming up with his knife ready. The creature swung its spined tail, smashing into the log with a crack that sent splinters flying. The woman shrieked and crawled back, her hands scraping against the soil. He darted forward, slashing his blade against the beast's side. The knife cut deep, but not deep enough. The monster roared, shaking the trees, and charged again. The human dodged, barely missing its claws. Every strike from the creature was strong enough to shatter bone. The woman watched in terror, clutching the bark as the battle raged. She whispered something, words he did not know, but her voice was trembling with desperation. It sounded like a prayer, or maybe a plea for him not to die. The beast snapped its jaws at him again. He jammed his knife into its shoulder, twisting, hard. The creature roared and threw him back with one swing. He hit the ground hard, breath forced from his lungs. His knife slipped from his hand, landing a few feet away. The beast turned toward the woman. She froze, her glowing eyes wide, her mouth open but no sound escaping. The monster lowered itself, preparing to strike. The human pushed himself up, every muscle screaming with pain. He saw his knife lying in the dirt, but he knew he would not. reach it in time. His eyes darted to the fallen log. Inside it, one of his old traps lay coiled, a rope and sharpened spikes he had not used. With no hesitation, he grabbed the rope, looping it around a jagged branch. As the beast lunged at the woman, he pulled hard. The spikes snapped forward, piercing the creature's neck. It howled, thrashing wildly, smashing trees as it staggered back. Blood poured down its chest, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The human grabbed his knife and charged, driving the blade deep into its throat. The beast roared one last time before collapsing, shaking the ground. The forest fell silent again, but the silence felt heavier now, filled with the smell of blood and death. He stood panting, his body aching, his hands shaking from the fight. The woman stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. She had expected death, but instead she saw him standing, protecting her with everything he had. Her lips parted, and for the first time she spoke in broken words he could almost understand. "Why, help me?" He looked at her, his chest rising and falling, and answered simply, "Because you need me." Her eyes softened. Fear still lived there, but behind it, something new had begun to glow. It was not trust yet, but it was the first step toward it, and as the night stretched long and cold, they both realized the forest was not done with them. The hunters were still searching, and the cries in the distance were growing closer. The beast's body lay still on the forest floor, its glowing blood sinking into the soil like fire dying in ashes. The smell of iron and rot filled the air, heavy and sharp. The human wiped his knife clean against the moss, his breath still, uneven, his chest rising and falling hard. The woman had not moved. She crouched near the broken log, her arms hugging her knees tightly. Her glowing eyes followed his every step, wide, with both fear and awe. She had seen him fight, seen him bleed, and most of all seen him choose to stand between her and death, yet her body still trembled, as if part of her refused to believe what had happened. He sheathed his knife and slowly crouched down at a safe distance. His voice came low and calm. "It's gone. You're safe now." He doubted she understood. The words, but the tone mattered more. Her breathing slowed a little, but she did not answer. Instead, her gaze shifted to the dead beast, then back to him, searching for meaning she could not find. Finally, she lowered her head, whispering softly in her own tongue. The words were broken, trembling, but the sound carried both relief and pain. He reached into his pack and pulled out the small piece of dried food he had been saving for himself. His body screamed for it, hunger clawing inside him, but when he looked at her pale face and bruised arms, the choice was already made. He placed the food on the ground between them and pushed it closer with a stick. She looked at it suspiciously, her eyes narrowing. Hunger battled with fear inside her. For a long moment, she only stared, but then her shaking hand reached forward. She grabbed the food quickly, like someone afraid it would be taken back. She bit into it, her lips trembling, and chewed slowly. The human said nothing. He only watched her eat, and when her eyes flicked up to meet his, he did not move. She turned away again, but this time her movements were slower, less panicked. The night pressed heavier around them. The wind rustled through the branches, carrying with it the faint echo of voices in the distance. The hunters were still out there. He knew they could not rest long, but for this brief moment, silence wrapped around them like a fragile blanket. The woman finished eating, then pressed her hands against the ground as if grounding herself. Her breathing had steadied. She looked at him again, this time not only with fear but also with confusion. She whispered something, a single word that sounded sharp and careful. She repeated it, pointing at herself. He realized it was her name. The sound was strange, not easy for his tongue, but he repeated it as best as he could. She blinked, surprised, then whispered it again softly, almost like a correction. He tried again, and this time her lips curved in the smallest hint of approval. She pointed at him next, waiting. He understood. He said his name. She repeated it, her accent bending the sound, but she tried. For the first time, their voices connected in something close to understanding. The forest seemed quieter after that. She moved closer, just an inch, but enough to show she was no longer frozen in terror. Her glowing eyes searched his face as if trying to measure the truth of his actions. She touched her chest lightly, whispering something else, then pointed at the beast's body and at the forest beyond. The words were unknown, but the meaning was clear. She was hunted, and not just by monsters. He nodded slowly. "I know," he murmured. His voice carried weight even if she did not understand. A sudden snap of branches made them both freeze. She stiffened instantly, her fear rushing back. The human stood, pulling his knife once more. Through the trees, shadows moved. For a moment, his muscles tensed for another fight, but then a small animal darted out and ran across the clearing. Relief came like a sigh. She looked at him again, her lips parting as if she wanted to laugh at the false alarm. But no sound came. Instead, her shoulders dropped slightly, the tension leaving her just a little. For the first time, she did not look at him like an enemy. He sat back down, keeping his knife ready, but his eyes remained on her. The fear in her gaze had not vanished, but behind it something faint and fragile had begun to grow. Trust. Still young, still weak, but real. The woman leaned back against the log, her glowing eyes flickering in the moonlight. She whispered his name once, soft and hesitant, like testing if it belonged on her lips. Then she closed her eyes, exhaustion finally pulling her into a restless sleep. The human stayed awake, his knife in his hand, his eyes on the dark forest. He listened to the distant calls of the hunters, knowing they were still searching. He knew the night was far from safe. But for now, as he watched over her, he realized something had changed. She was no longer just a captive caught in his trap. She was someone who looked at him differently now, someone who had begun to believe he might not harm her. And as the cold wind carried the sound of danger closer, the spark of trust between them glowed like a fragile flame, small, but strong, enough to survive the night. The forest did not sleep. Even as the moon sank lower, shadows stretched longer and the air grew colder. The human sat awake with his knife in hand, every muscle tense, his eyes scanning the trees. The alien woman lay close to the hollow log, her body curled tightly, her breaths shallow but steady. But exhaustion had finally pulled her into rest, but her trembling never stopped, as if even in dreams she could not escape her fear. He knew the hunters were near. The strange metallic cries had echoed through the night again and again, growing louder, circling like wolves closing in. He had seen the signs too, broken branches, disturbed soil, footprints larger than his own. Whoever hunted her was skilled, patient, and ruthless. At dawn, the first light bled through the trees, pale and weak. The woman stirred, her glowing eyes opening slowly. For a moment, confusion flashed across her face as if she had forgotten where she was. Then she saw him sitting guard, knife ready, and her body tightened again. But this time she did not shrink away. Instead, she whispered his name softly, as if testing it on her lips again. He nodded once, answering her quiet greeting. Then he motioned for silence, pointing into the trees. Her head snapped up, her eyes narrowing as she listened. Somewhere not far away, voices drifted through the forest, harsh, guttural, heavy with command. The words were foreign, but their tone carried danger. She pressed her hand to her chest and whispered something quickly, her voice shaking. She pointed toward the sound, then back to herself. Her meaning was clear. They were searching for her. The human clenched his jaw. Leaving her here meant she would be found within minutes. Taking her with him meant both of them would be hunted. Yet the choice was no longer a question. He reached down, offering his hand. For a heartbeat, she hesitated, then placed her trembling fingers in his. They moved deeper into the forest, careful with every step. The air grew thicker, filled with tension. Branches snapped under their boots, leaves rustled as if warning of their path. The woman clung to him, her strength still weak, but her glowing eyes scanned the shadows with sharp awareness. She knew this forest better than him, and he could see her listening, tilting her head as if tracking the hunter's movements by sound alone. They reached a narrow ridge where the trees thinned. From here, They could see the valley below. Shapes moved among the trees, tall figures wrapped in dark armor, carrying long spears that glowed faintly. Their faces were hidden, but their steps were sure, their formation tight. These were no wandering beasts. They were soldiers. The woman froze at the sight, her breath catching in her throat. She whispered again, her voice urgent, pointing at the hunters below. Her words tumbled out fast, but he caught one sound repeated again, and again on a word that might have meant clan or masters. He understood enough. These were not strangers. They belonged to her people, or at least to those who had once claimed her. But if they were searching with such hunger, then she was not being rescued. She was being hunted. The human pulled her back from the ridge, keeping them hidden behind the trees. Her body shook, her hands clutching his arm as though letting go would mean death. He steadied her, lowering his voice to a whisper. "They will not take you." She stared at him, her eyes wide, disbelief written across her face. Her lips parted as if she wanted to argue, to tell him it was impossible. But the way he held his knife, the way his voice carried a promise, stopped her. Suddenly, the hunters' voices grew louder. They were climbing the ridge, moving closer. The woman pressed herself against him, her glowing eyes filled with terror. He scanned the ground quickly and spotted a cluster of thick roots hollowed by time. It was barely large enough for two, but it would have to do. He pulled her toward it, crouching low, pressing into the shadows. The hunters passed above them, their heavy steps shaking the ground. The metallic sound of their weapons rang with each movement. The woman buried her face against his shoulder, holding her breath. He kept his hand over her back, steady, silent, waiting. One of the hunters stopped, his head turned slowly, scanning the ridge. The human's grip tightened on his knife. If the hunter looked down, if he saw them, there would be no choice but to fight. The silence stretched thin, every second sharp as a blade. Finally, the hunter moved on, following the others. Their voices faded into the distance, swallowed by the forest. Only then did the woman lift her head, her body trembling violently. She looked at him with wide eyes, her lips moving in broken words. "Danger, not safe, they find me, they kill you." Her voice cracked on the last word. She was not just afraid for herself. She was afraid for him. He placed his hand gently on her arm, meeting her gaze. "Then we stay ahead of them." She shook her head, tears gathering in her eyes. But for the first time, she did not try to pull away. She stayed close, her trust growing in the shadow of danger. As the sun rose higher, lighting the forest in pale gold, the human realized the truth. The greatest enemy was not the beasts of the night. It was the hunters, relentless and merciless, who would never stop until they had her back. And now, by protecting her, he had placed himself in their path. The morning light did not bring comfort. It only revealed more of the danger waiting around them. The hunters had left the ridge, but their presence lingered like smoke after fire. The human knew they were circling, closing in from every side. The woman walked beside him, her steps uneven, her body weak, yet her glowing eyes sharp with fear. She kept looking back, whispering broken words that carried the same meaning again and again. They would not stop. He guided her deeper into the forest, toward thicker trees where the ground dipped into marsh and fog. Each step was harder, the soil wet and soft, but the cover would hide them for a while. She stumbled once, nearly falling, and he caught her arm before she hit the ground. For a moment, her fingers gripped his hand tightly, desperate and trembling. Then she pulled back, ashamed of her weakness, but the connection remained. The fog wrapped around them like a curtain, muffling sound, blurring sight. For a short time, it felt like safety. But then came the sound of horns, long and sharp, carrying across the trees. The hunters were calling to each other, marking the trail. The woman froze, clutching his sleeve, whispering quickly. He did not understand the words, but her voice broke with despair. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "We will find a way," he said, steady and calm. She stared at him as though she wanted to believe, but doubt clouded her eyes. Hours passed, as they pushed through the fog. Hunger gnawed at him, and she was too weak to walk far without resting. He knew they could not keep moving like this. At last he spotted the ruins of stone walls half buried in moss, the remains of some forgotten structure swallowed by the forest. He led her inside, guiding her to a corner where the stones still stood tall. Here they could hide, if only for a while. She sank to the ground, her head resting against the cold stone. Her breathing was heavy, her body trembling. He sat near the entrance, knife in hand, watching the mist shift outside. The silence pressed down on them until finally she spoke. Her voice was low, broken, but clear enough. "Leave me," she said, the words heavy with pain. He turned sharply toward her. She lowered her head, her tangled hair falling across her face. "They want me, not you. If you stay, they kill you too." Her voice cracked, almost breaking. "Go. You live." For a long moment he said nothing. He looked at her, fragile, frightened, yet filled with a strange kind of strength. She was willing to give herself up to save him, willing to return to the hands of those who hunted her. He felt anger rise inside him, sharp and burning, not at her, but at the world that had broken her into believing her life was worth less than his. He moved closer, his voice firm. "No." She lifted her head, her glowing eyes wide, confusion mixing with desperation. He leaned closer, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "I will not leave you." Her lips parted, but no words came. She shook her head weakly, tears filling her eyes. She could not understand why he would choose danger over safety, why he would fight for someone who was not even of his kind. Yet, his voice carried no doubt, only truth. Before she could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed through the fog. Shadows moved between the trees, armor glinting faintly in the pale light. The hunters had found the ruins. The woman's body shook as she pressed back against the stone. He rose to his feet, knife ready, his body tense. The hunters' voices carried closer, calling out in their harsh tongue. She reached for his hand, suddenly, gripping it tightly. Her glowing eyes met his, wide with fear but also with something else. A plea. "Run," she whispered, her voice breaking. He squeezed her hand instead. "Together," he said firmly. The first hunter stepped. Through the fog, tall and armored, spear glowing faintly in his hand. Behind him, more shadows appeared, closing in from every side. There was no escape. The human stood in front of her, his body blocking her from their view. His knife looked small against their weapons, but his stance carried unshakable resolve. He knew he might not survive, but he would not let them take her. The hunters shouted, their voices sharp and commanding. One pointed his spear toward the woman. She let out a choked sound, pressing closer to the wall. The human's grip tightened on his knife. In that moment, the choice lay before him. He could surrender her and live, or he could stand against them and likely die. But his mind was already made. He stepped forward, his voice steady as steel. "She is not yours." The hunters paused, surprised at his defiance. Their leader growled something sharp, and the others spread out, surrounding the ruins. The human felt the woman clutching his sleeve, trembling, whispering broken words. But when he looked back, her eyes met his with something new. The fear was still there, but behind it shone the first spark of faith. The impossible choice was no longer impossible. He had chosen, and there was no turning back. As the hunters advanced, he raised his knife, ready to fight. The hunters closed in, their armor clattering softly, their glowing spears lighting the fog like fireflies. The ruins became a cage of stone and shadow, with no way out. The human stood tall, knife ready in his hand, his body placed firmly between the woman and those who wanted her. He could feel her trembling behind him, clutching the back of his sleeve as if it was the only thing keeping her alive. The leader of the hunters stepped forward, taller than the rest, his armor marked with red symbols that glowed faintly. His voice thundered across the ruins, guttural and commanding. Though the human could not understand the words, the meaning was clear. Surrender the woman. The human's grip on the knife tightened. His voice cut through the cold air. "No." The woman gasped behind him, whispering quickly in her language. He turned his head slightly and saw her eyes glisten with both terror and disbelief. She had expected him to give her up, but instead, he had chosen to stand. The hunters roared in anger. The first lunged forward, spear aimed at his chest. The human sidestepped, slashing his knife against the hunter's arm. Sparks flew as blade met armor. The hunter growled and stumbled back. Another came from the side, swinging his weapon with brutal force. The human ducked low, rolling across the stone floor, rising with his knife flashing in the pale light. The woman pressed herself against the wall, her hands shaking, her voice whispering his name like a prayer. She had seen men fight before, but never like this. Never with such fire, never with such reckless courage. Two hunters attacked together, their spears thrusting forward like fangs. He blocked one with his forearm, pain slicing through his flesh, but he ignored it. His knife struck deep into the second hunter's side, sliding between plates of armor. The warrior collapsed with a sharp cry. Blood stained the stones. The others hesitated, shocked at his defiance. A single human unarmored, fighting against trained hunters, and it was unthinkable. But the human did not falter. His chest burned, his muscles screamed, yet his stance remained unbroken. He was no longer just surviving. He was protecting. The leader growled again, furious, and raised his spear. Its tip glowed brighter, humming with deadly energy. He marched forward, pointing it straight at the woman. She cried out, covering her, head with her arms, certain the end had come. But the human leaped in front of her, catching the spear against his knife. The impact jolted through his body, nearly shattering his grip. Sparks exploded in the air. He pushed back with everything he had, his teeth clenched, his feet digging into the stone. The woman's eyes filled with tears as she watched him fight. For her, a man who had no reason to risk his life, no promise of reward, no bond except the one he had chosen. With a sudden surge, the human twisted the spear aside and slammed his knife into the leader's chest. The armor cracked, the blade cutting deep. The leader roared and staggered back, clutching his wound. The others froze, their voices rising in sharp cries of shock. The woman rose shakily to her feet. For the first time, she shouted. Her voice, strong and commanding in her own tongue. The hunter's eyes snapped to her. She spoke again, her words sharp like blades. Though the human could not understand, he knew by the way the hunters hesitated that her voice carried power. The leader, bleeding and gasping, barked an order. The hunters pulled back, dragging him away. Their glowing spears dimmed as they retreated. Into the fog, their voices fading with distance. The ruins fell silent again. The human dropped to one knee, breathing hard, his knife slipping from his bloody hand. His body shook with exhaustion. The woman rushed to him, her glowing eyes wide with worry. She pressed her hands against his arm where blood ran down, whispering, broken words filled with desperation. He looked up at her, his face pale but steady. I told you, he whispered. They will not take you. Her tears fell freely now, not of fear, but of something deeper. She touched his face with trembling fingers, her voice soft, almost breaking. You saved me. He nodded, too tired to speak further. She leaned closer, her forehead resting against his, her voice trembling with new strength. You caught me in your trap, but you also caught my heart. The words hung in the air, fragile yet unshakable. In that moment, the fear that had ruled her eyes since the first night began to fade. What replaced it was not only trust, but something more. A bond born from pain, courage, and sacrifice. The human closed his eyes for a moment, letting her presence steady him. The hunters would return one day, stronger and angrier, but for now they were safe. As the dawn light broke fully through the trees, painting the ruins in gold, the woman took his hand and held it tightly. She was no longer just a captive, no longer just a victim running from shadows. She was someone who had found hope again, and he was no longer alone.